I worked in family law for 31 years. I have sat across from women with bruises they tried to cover with foundation, women who whispered because they forgot they were allowed to speak at full volume, women who apologized to me for crying in my office. I thought I had seen everything this kind of pain could look like. I had not seen it wearing my daughter's face. Her name is Sylvie. She was 29 when she married my son-in-law, and she was the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. Not loud, not showy, just present in a way that made people lean toward her. She had her father's laugh and my stubbornness, and when she was small she used to argue with me about bedtime using logic. So sound, I sometimes had to hide in the hallway to laugh before I went back in to tell her the answer was still no. She met him at a conference in Chicago. He was in commercial real estate, well-dressed, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order after one meeting. His name was Fletcher. Fletcher Crane. And from the very first time I shook his hand, something in the back of my mind filed a note I did not look at again for almost 2 years. He was too smooth. Not charming, smooth. There is a difference. Charming people make you feel good about yourself. Smooth people make you feel good about them. But Sylvie was happy, or she looked happy, and I told myself that note in the back of my mind was just a mother's reluctance to let go. I had seen enough of the world to know that my instincts were not infallible, so I folded that feeling up and I put it away. The wedding was in September at a vineyard outside Charlottesville. It was beautiful. Sylvie wore a dress with sleeves that caught the wind, and when she walked toward Fletcher at the altar, she was smiling so wide I had to look down at my program to keep from completely losing myself. My husband, God rest him, had been gone for 6 years by then, and walking her down that aisle alone was the hardest and most sacred thing I have ever done. Fletcher's mother sat in the front row on his side. Her name was Meredith. She was 63, dressed in a champagne suit that probably cost more than my car payment, and she watched the ceremony with an expression I could only describe as assessment. Not joy, not sentiment. She was watching the whole thing the way a person watches a contractor work, checking for errors. I noticed. I told myself I was being uncharitable. The first year was fine, or at least it looked fine from the outside. They bought a house in Arlington. Sylvie kept her job at the nonprofit where she'd worked for 4 years. She ran their community outreach programs, and she was extraordinary at it. Fletcher made good money. They seemed settled, but Sylvie started calling me less. When she did call, there was a pause before she answered questions. A small one. A half-second delay, the kind you barely notice until you notice it every single time. I asked her once, early on, how things were going with Fletcher's family. She said fine. Then she said Meredith had opinions about how Sylvie kept the house. I asked what kind of opinions. She laughed it off. You know how mothers-in-law are, she said. I did know. I also knew she had never used that tone with me before. Careful, measured. Like she was editing herself in real time. About 14 months into the marriage, my daughter quit her job. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me Fletcher thought it would be better if she focused on the home for a while. They were talking about starting a family. The commute was long. He traveled a lot, and it was hard to keep everything running smoothly when she was also working full-time. I sat very still on my end of the phone. I asked her if this was what she wanted. She said, of course. I asked if she was sure. She said, Mom, I'm sure. And there was that pause again, that tiny editorial pause, and I knew she was not telling me everything. But I did not yet know how much she was leaving out. What I did not know then, what I would only piece together later, was that Fletcher had been quietly, methodically, rearranging her life for over a year. It had started with small things. He didn't like her going out with her friends from work on weeknights because he worried about her driving late. He suggested she take a break from the group therapy sessions she'd attended since her 20s because he thought she was too focused on processing the past instead of building their future. He had opinions about her wardrobe. Not controlling opinions. He framed them as preferences, as things that made him feel proud to be seen with her. She started dressing differently. She started staying in more. She started apologizing for things that did not require apology. And all the while, Meredith was there, reinforcing every adjustment, praising Sylvie when she deferred to Fletcher, making pointed comments when she didn't. Once, during a birthday dinner for Fletcher at their house, Meredith had apparently remarked that Sylvie's salmon was overcooked, then looked at Fletcher and said, "She's still learning." Sylvie had smiled and agreed. I was not at that dinner. If I had been, things might have moved faster. But I wasn't. I became more deliberate about visiting. I started driving up to Arlington on Saturday mornings, bringing coffee, staying for a few hours. Fletcher was usually pleasant with me around. Careful, even. Meredith, I saw only occasionally, always at structured events, holidays, birthdays, where everyone's behavior was managed by the occasion. Sylvie seemed tired, not sleep-deprived tired. Tired in the way that people get when they spend years translating themselves. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was November. Sylvie had invited me for Thanksgiving, and Meredith was also there, along with Fletcher's younger brother and his girlfriend. 6 of us around a table in my daughter's dining room. Sylvie had cooked for 2 days. I know, because I had talked to her the Wednesday night before, and she was still making the sweet potato pie. She had set the table beautifully. She had ironed the cloth napkins. She had done everything, and she had done it with the particular brand of effort that comes from wanting to make something perfect because you are afraid of what imperfect looks like. About halfway through dinner, the conversation turned to Christmas plans. Meredith wanted everyone at her house in McLean. She said so as a statement, not an invitation. Fletcher nodded immediately. Sylvie said she had hoped to spend Christmas morning here and then drive up to McLean in the afternoon. Fletcher put his fork down. The table got quiet in the way tables get quiet whenever one senses what is coming, but no one wants to acknowledge it. He told her that was not what they had discussed. His voice was even, almost bored. He said they had already decided, and he didn't understand why she was bringing this up in front of everyone. Sylvie said she thought she had mentioned it. Her voice was small. She was already retreating before the conversation was over. He said she hadn't mentioned it. He said she had a habit of remembering things the way she wanted to, rather than the way they happened. He said it calmly, the way you might explain directions to someone who'd gotten lost. And then, I want to be very precise here because I've gone over this moment hundreds of times. He reached across the corner of the table and he grabbed her wrist, not to hold her hand, to stop her from reaching for her wine glass. And he squeezed. It was not a long moment, maybe 3 seconds, but I watched my daughter go still in a way that told me this had happened before. Not the wrist, maybe, but the stillness. She knew what that stillness was for. She had learned it. Meredith picked up her wine glass and said with a small smile, "She just needs to keep track of things better. Fletcher is very organized. It's an adjustment." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. I set my fork down. I picked up my napkin from my lap, and I placed it folded on the table next to my plate. I looked at Fletcher. I looked at Meredith. Then I looked at Sylvie. I said, "Excuse me for just a moment." And I walked to the hallway and I took out my phone. I want to tell you who I called, because this matters. I called a colleague of mine, a woman I'd worked alongside for nearly 15 years, a family law attorney who now handled civil protective orders and had 3 investigators on retainer. Her name doesn't need to be part of this story. What matters is that she answered on the second ring, and when I told her what I had just watched happen at that table, she did not express surprise. She asked me 2 questions. She told me what to do next. I walked back into that dining room. I sat down. I picked up my fork. I ate a bite of stuffing and I asked Fletcher's brother how his drive up from Richmond had been. I was pleasant for the rest of that meal. I made sure of it. Because in 31 years of family law, I had learned one thing above almost everything else. When you move, you only get to move once. You have to be ready before you move. I was not ready yet, but I would be. Over the next 3 weeks, I did what my colleague advised. I started keeping a written record, dates, times, what I had observed, what Sylvie had told me over the past 2 years that I had filed away without fully examining. I wrote down the job. I wrote down the therapy she had stopped. I wrote down the therapy she had stopped. I wrote down the friends who had quietly fallen away. I wrote down the wrist. I drove up to Arlington on a weekday when I knew Fletcher had a flight to Houston. I brought coffee, and I sat across from my daughter at her kitchen table, and I did not ask her if she was okay. I had learned, both professionally and now personally, that question almost never produces truth. Instead, I said, "I need to tell you what I saw at Thanksgiving." She tried to minimize it. She said he hadn't meant it that way. She said she had provoked him by bringing up Christmas at the wrong moment. She said Meredith was just protective of her son. She said the word sorry twice in 3 minutes, and neither time was she apologizing for anything she had actually done wrong. I did not argue with her. I had learned not to argue. I let her talk, and I listened, and I kept my voice steady. And I said, "I hear you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you that I see you. I see what's happening. And whatever you decide, I need you to know that there is a door open and it will not close." She cried for a long time. And then she told me things I had suspected and things I had not. How he monitored her phone. How he had moved her personal savings, money she had saved before the marriage, into a joint account she did not have full access to. How Meredith had once told her early in the marriage that Fletcher had a temper that women who loved him learned to work around, and that this was presented as advice, as wisdom, as something to be grateful for being told. I stayed 4 hours that day. Before I left, I gave her the name of a counselor, not couples counseling, individual therapy, someone my colleague trusted, and I gave her a prepaid phone I had stopped at a drugstore to buy on the way there. I told her to use it when she needed to talk without worrying about who was reading. She called me on that phone 9 days later at 11:30 at night. She was in the bathroom with the door locked. She spoke very quietly. She said she was ready. I will spare you the legal specifics because they are complicated and because the details belong to my daughter's privacy more than they belong to this story. But I will tell you that we moved quickly, and we moved with documentation. My colleague filed for an emergency protective order. A forensic accountant, someone my colleague worked with regularly, reviewed the joint account and what had happened to Sylvie's premarital savings. Fletcher's employer, a firm with a strict professional conduct policy, received a formal inquiry. He did not see it coming. That was by design. Smooth people assume their control is invisible. They don't account for the possibility that someone has been quietly watching and writing things down for 3 weeks. He vacated the Arlington house within 30 days. The financial piece took longer, these things always do, but her savings were restored, and the house, which she had contributed to with an inheritance from her grandfather, was addressed in the separation terms. Meredith called me once during this period. She was not warm. She told me I had destroyed her son's marriage by interfering in something I did not understand. She said Sylvie was fragile and had misinterpreted things. She said Fletcher was heartbroken. I let her finish. Then I said, "Meredith, I watched your son grab my daughter's wrist at her own Thanksgiving table while you smiled and made excuses. I have been in family law for 3 decades. I know exactly what I saw." And then I said, "I hope you find peace." And I ended the call. That was the last time she and I spoke. Sylvie stayed in the Arlington house. She went back to therapy, real therapy, consistent therapy, with someone who helped her trace the shape of what had happened and understand why it had been so hard to name. She called her friends she had lost touch with. She took a long weekend in late January and drove down to Charlottesville, to the vineyard where she had gotten married, and she walked the property alone in the cold and then drove home. She told me later that she cried the entire drive back, not out of grief for Fletcher, out of grief for the 2 years she had spent making herself smaller in rooms she had every right to fill. She got a new job in March, a senior director position at a larger organization, the kind of role she would have been offered 2 years earlier if she had not stepped back. The morning of her first day, she called me from the parking lot before she went in. She sounded like herself. I mean that specifically. She sounded like the woman who had argued with me about bedtime at age 7 with ironclad logic. Present. Clear. Taking up the right amount of space. I want to say something directly to anyone who is watching this and recognizing something. The thing about this kind of control is that it does not announce itself. It arrives dressed as love and consideration and concern. It arrives as a man who remembers your coffee order and makes you feel chosen, and then very slowly it begins to rearrange the furniture of your life until you can't quite remember where anything used to be. And if you are watching from the outside, a mother, a sister, a friend, and something in you has filed a note that you haven't looked at, look at it. You do not have to have all the answers before you open the door. You just have to open it and make sure the person you love knows it is there. The day before Sylvie started that new job, she came and had dinner with me. I made the same sweet potato pie she had made for Thanksgiving. We sat at my kitchen table, and we talked for 3 hours, and she laughed 3 times so hard she had to put her fork down, and every single one of those laughs was the real one, the one she got from her father, the one I had not heard in over 2 years. That laugh is why I made one call. That is the only reason I needed. I have thought a lot about what made the difference, not just in Sylvie's situation, but in every situation I watched unfold across 31 years of sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives. And what I keep coming back to is this. The outcome was never determined by the moment of crisis. It was determined by everything that happened before it and after it, in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the choices that didn't look like choices at the time. Fletcher was not a mystery. He was a pattern, and patterns, if you are willing to look at them honestly, will always tell you the truth before the crisis does. The way he spoke over Sylvie in small moments, the way Meredith framed cruelty as wisdom, the way a woman who had once argued her bedtime at age 7 with airtight logic had learned to pause before finishing her own sentences. These were not random. They were cause and effect, playing out slowly enough that each individual moment seemed manageable, even dismissible. That is how this kind of harm sustains itself, not through drama, but through accumulation. What I know now, more clearly than I ever did even as a professional, is that moral clarity is not a feeling. It is a practice. It requires you to look at what is actually in front of you and call it by its right name, even when naming it is inconvenient, even when the person you love is asking you not to. I almost put that feeling away permanently. The note I had filed the first time I shook Fletcher's hand. I told myself it was bias, protectiveness, a mother's difficulty letting go, and in doing so, I nearly became a passive participant in what happened to my daughter. That is the thing no one talks about. The people who love us can cause harm, not through malice, but through the decision to look away. The intelligence to understand what is happening is not enough on its own. I had that. I had years of professional training that told me exactly what I was watching unfold. But knowledge without the willingness to act on it, carefully, strategically at the right moment, is just an expensive form of witness. What changed everything was the decision to move from understanding to doing, to stop waiting for a moment that was clean and comfortable, and instead to work with the moment I had, imperfect and frightening as it was. And Sylvie, what she showed me in those months after, was something I could not have taught her and could not have given her. She found it herself. The strength to rebuild is not something that arrives from outside. It is uncovered from inside, usually after everything that was piled on top of it has finally been cleared away. She went back to therapy. She called the friends she had lost. She walked alone in the cold at that vineyard and cried the whole drive home, and then she got up the next morning and kept going. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. I made one call, but she made 1,000 quiet decisions after that, each one choosing herself. I think about those decisions more than I think about the call.